Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce, and I'm super excited today to be joined by someone that hopefully will give us some fantastic information, from the ground, if you like, about what's going on in Africa, which is a place that I've reported on a little bit previously. We know that there's Russian influence growing there, has been for some time. But I've probably not focused on it as much as I should have done because I don't know enough about it, in all honesty. And hopefully Philip Obaji Jr. is going to help us with that. This is early UK time. I don't know how many people are going to be watching this live, but I think this will be a really useful resource going forward. So, Philip, thank you so much for joining us. Do you want to just let the audience know a little bit about yourself, who you are, what your background is?
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for having me. Yes. So, I am a journalist who comes from Nigeria, born and raised in Nigeria. And in the last decade, I have been a correspondent for the Daily Beast, which is a news and culture website based in Washington, based in New York. So I have been reporting all this while since I joined the Beast in 2015 on issues around terrorism, counterinsurgency, espionage, fanaticism, and what have you. But my focus in the last 5 years has been almost entirely on the operations of mercenaries from the Russian Wagner group who are active in countries like the Central African Republic, Mali, Burkina Faso, Libya, Sudan, and what have you. And I have uncovered so much in terms of atrocities committed by Russian paramilitaries in West and Central Africa, from massacres to incidents of rape, sexual abuse, and what have you. Reporting has not been so easy for me, so it's been very difficult covering these stories, as you will assume, because the Russian Wagner paramilitaries have had to target journalists like me who have been exposing much atrocities that they have committed. Well, I have been lucky to speak on a number of platforms since I began to report on the Wagner Group. I testified at the U.S. Helsinki Commission hearing on Russia's imperial identity in Washington, D.C. last year. I've spoken in quite a number of forums on Russian disinformation and forums that focused on the atrocities of Russian paramilitaries in Africa, and I've won multiple awards for my coverage. Thank you.
Good on you. Well, it's really important, and actually, what you're doing is covering quite a large area as well, by the sounds of it. I mean, geographically, this is a huge area that with a number of countries. I mean, really, you could be just concentrating your work on just Nigeria, right? So
Yes.
you've got a lot to report. I was wondering if, for the benefit of the audience, I could just run through my understanding of Russian influence starting in the Central African Republic, which, am I right in saying that's one of the major places that Russia got a foothold first of all? Is that correct?
That's correct, Jonathan. And it all began in 2018. That's when we talk about when Russia sent boots on the ground. Now, the Central African Republic descended into a civil war in 2013 when rebels tried to overthrow the government. And the war was mainly fought between Christian militias and Muslim rebels. But the idea, or what was behind this war, was the fact that these warring parties were fighting to take control of the government. So when the war began, the UN imposed an arms embargo on the Central African Republic. But somehow the country managed to hold elections 3 years after, and then they elected the current president, Faustin Archange Touadéra. The problem Touadéra had was that when he took office in 2016, he inherited a country in which only the capital, Bangui, was under government control. The rest of the country remained in the hands of these warring factions. So he knew that without getting help externally, it was only a matter of time before these armed men overtook the capital. And so he ran to Russia for assistance, first in getting the UN Security Council to lift the arms embargo, and next to get Russia's help in training Central African armed forces and also in sending boots on the ground to help fight against these rebels. Now, Moscow accepted, but with the condition that they will have access to the gold and diamond mines that were all spread across the country. Problem was that none of these mines were located in Bangui, which was at the time the only part of the country controlled by the government. So when the Russians came into the Central African Republic in 2018, the first thing they did was to provide security for the president Tudera, and then they began to train the local armed forces. But it was also important for them to explore the gold resources of the country, and so they began to travel to these areas where the mines were located. Now, because none of these mines were under the control of government, the Russians had to fight against the armed groups that control these areas to be able to gain access. Now, they have been doing so with so much brutality, massacres. They could go into a community and then open fire at anyone they see just because they feel that they need to get complete control of the mine in this community. So we have seen in the last 7 years so many cases of abuse, and I have listened to numerous incidents of human rights atrocities, whether it's rape, whether it's killing in a very gruesome manner, whether it's torture of local artisanal miners, and what have you. So since 2018, the Russians have been in the Central African Republic, and they have consolidated their presence there. The National Security Advisor to the president has been a Russian for the past 6 years, and the communications advisor to the president was a Russian, and the Russians are the ones teaching out instructions to members of the armed forces in the Central African Republic. So that's what we're seeing right now in that country.
So the way I understand it is that 2013 to sort of 2016, 17, it was pretty chaotic. And the French, so the context is the French, this is all kind of part of the old French empire of old. You know, the French have been involved for 150 odd years or whatever it is in this part of the world. And it's a francophone part of the world where a lot of countries like the Central African Republic speak French. And the French have got big involvement there, but they've had quite an extractive, exploitative relationship with these places. I would have thought over time, being a colonial setup, and from 2013 onwards, as you say, there was a bit of a civil war going on, and it got to a point where France were able to make it safe enough to run elections, as you said, in 2016, and then it was kind of politically chaotic. The French and the Europeans were sort of training soldiers, but it was only with wooden sticks by some accounts. And then what happened is, and correct me if I'm wrong, that Macron actually in 2017, and this is after the annexation of Crimea, but Macron kind of suggested that the country go to Russia to get military training, I believe. And then so it was inviting Russia in because the relationship was good enough with Russia, and it wasn't thought that Russia would do anything too crazy. But then actually Russia then came in, provided training, then provided security, and actually the French were pushed out as they were seen as not as effective, the French Foreign Legion, partly because, if I understand it correctly, the Wagner were so brutal that they could bring kind of peace to areas or stability to areas which were operating diamond mines and whatnot. But of course, they then helped themselves to that as well. And it's incredibly brutal, but there was a void that was left. And then they could use their disinformation to make people further worried about France, and it was a very anti-French kind of setup. And then you get to a point now where that brutality has become ensconced within the Central African Republic, and then Russia are effectively kind of running it. Is that about right?
Yes, and another reason why the Russians had their way in the beginning was that if you look at the country, Bangui, at the time the Russians came in, was the only area in the country that was under government control. Now, the people in Bangui lived in fear at the time, thinking that it was just a matter of time before these armed men took over the capital. So when the Russians came, helped provide security for Bangui, and then pushed these militiamen further up the country. So a lot of people in the capital were very happy with what they saw. I mean, at the time that the French, had troops in the country under peacekeeping mission, we didn't see, or they didn't see any positives in the sense that the militiamen were advancing. So you expect that when you have foreign intervention, especially from a country with that have very skilled military personnel, you should see that there are gains in their presence, in the sense that more territory is being won by the government. But that wasn't the case. So when the Russians came, and that's where they get credit for at least ensuring that the government remained in power and Bangui was not being taken by force. So
Is that
people,
because they are much more willing to be just really quite violent and break the law in a sense, like in because there's also MINUSCA there, which is the I'll just
the
show that
UN
to
peacekeeping
people.
force, yeah,
Yeah, UN peacekeeping force that has quite a presence, or did, I don't know if it still does, had quite a presence there. But people were like hoping maybe that MINUSCA could rule the country or help do, but of course they can't. And then with Wagner being so much more able to be brutal, they can just bring about some kind of sense of stability.
your guess is right, Jonathan. I mean, we've seen the same tactics in Ukraine. So what Wagner does is they go to a particular place, they want results, and they don't care how they get the results, even if it means killing everyone they see. So
Yeah.
they have been using these brutal tactics and being so desperate to achieve their goals. Their goals is to get into communities, take over gold mines, and do business there. So that's the difference. I mean, the UN peacekeepers are in many places in the country, but they more or less want to defend communities from aggression rather than go after the aggressors. So they're more or less like a defensive force than an aggressive one. But the Russians just go in and get the job done based on what they think is the right thing. And the right thing for them is just, open fire. Yeah.
I mean, are the objectives for Wagner, because now that Prigozhin has died and Wagner
Yeah.
have been taken over by the Russian government, so that
Yeah.
used to be that Wagner was like this kind of murky grey area. It
Yeah.
wasn't the Russian state, but it is acting on behalf of the Russian state in order to get money and actually votes in the UN. I think that's a really
Yeah.
significant thing here.
That's correct.
Now, it seems like the Africa Corps is now more overtly actually just the Russian state, and they are just involved in making money out of these countries and then ensuring that when it comes to a vote in the UN, they are secured on behalf of Russia. Is that
Yeah.
right?
That's correct. And if you're going to ask me if anything has changed since after the death of Prigozhin, I'll say no, in the sense that you still have the same operational commanders running the show, especially in the Central African Republic. Dimitri City, who was more or less the operational head, of the Wagner group before the death of Prigozhin, is still playing a similar role in the Central African Republic. And you look at the issues that have happened, the killings that have happened after Prigozhin. I went to the Central African Republic in 2023, in around December, just to be able to find out what was going on in the country after Prigozhin's death. And I was still able to uncover a massacre that took place in Kuki, which is in the northwestern part of the country, in which over 50 people were killed, you know. And there's still other reports ongoing about killings in gruesome manner, about rape. I uncovered, a scheme where hundreds of women were raped in Boa, which is the biggest city in the northwest of the Central African Republic. So in terms of how these people operate in the country, nothing has changed since the death of Prigozhin.
So, before we talk about sort of disinformation and influence operations, I mean, I guess that if you're trying to solve, I mean, the problem is for France and the EU is they've kind of been pushed out, or France and Europe, they've been pushed out. They've lost these countries now
Yeah,
to Russia effectively, and in order to change that situation, or in order to get Russia out of here, Russia offer a functional benefit to at least the people who are running the country,
yeah,
if not the people on the ground. So in order to get rid of Wagner and get rid of Russia, you have to provide the same sort of thing. Like it's just really difficult. I don't know how you go about doing that unless you kind of are trying to walk in and get a regime change.
That's correct. It's very difficult to do anything in these countries because the regime in these countries are all allied to Russia, and it's even more worrisome when you look at the Sahel area. You look at Niger, you look at Mali, you look at Burkina Faso. These three countries are currently under military dictatorship. Some of them were even helped by the Russians to seize power. In Mali, for example, the leaders of the coup. I did an investigation in Mali on the leaders of the coup in 2020, and I realized that they went to Russia in January on training, and then returned to Mali in August, and just a few days after they toppled the government, So, exactly from what you read. I mean, from my investigations, it was clear that they planned this coup while they were in Russia. And it's even more difficult because the African Union, the European Union, ECOWAS, which is the West Africa regional body, they've all sanctioned these countries. Yeah, so when the coup happened, when democratic rule was truncated, this powerful blocs sanctioned these countries. Now, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger did not have friends anymore. So the only powerful friend, that they had, the only powerful country that was willing to embrace them was Russia. And since then, they have developed stronger ties with Russia, and they're getting help from Russia in terms of propaganda and disinformation to be able to prop up their own regimes. So that's the issue that any other country has in terms of being able to intervene in these countries, because Russia has built a solid relationship with these countries, and they're not willing to even let anyone come in between this relationship. So the best thing to do, in my opinion, is to see how this propaganda and disinformation can be countered.
So give me an example of what Russia does in terms of disinformation, because as I understand it, when they came into Central African Republic, you started seeing sort of radio stations. There was even a film called Tourist that was kind of a propaganda film to do with, I guess, their operations there. There were even beauty contests, language schools, all sorts of things to allow Russia to spread their disinformation, which will be about Ukraine, about Russia, about Russia's, even the cultural history of Russia and the history of Russia's involvement in World War II. All of this is kind of spread. So am I right in saying the people on the ground outside of those who are directly affected by the kind of murdering and atrocities are people generally in favor of Russia because actually they're just getting a diet of disinformation?
Well, if you go to the areas where there's much enlightenment, I would say yes, the people are in love with Wagner to a reasonable extent, or to some extent. Now, I'll give you an example in the Central African Republic. In Bangui, if you speak to the average person in Bangui, he or she will tell you that there's relative peace in Bangui since the Russians came on board. And that is true, because there was always fighting around Bangui before the Russians got involved in 2018. Now, because much of the atrocities don't take place in Bangui, so many people do not really realize what the Russians have been up to, because a lot of these, abuses are elsewhere in the Andahar northeastern region, in the northwestern region, and what have you. So these are the regions where people have felt the brutality of these Russian paramilitaries, where a lot of people would depend on artisanal mining to cater for their families, have had to lose their jobs. A lot of families have lost a lot of children have lost their parents. So you don't find people that much in Bangui talking about, what wrong the Russians have done. The other thing is that internet penetration in much of the country is so poor. In most parts of the Central African Republic, the internet is still on 2G, so to speak. So it's very difficult achieving it for people to even know what's going on. So that's the difference. Now, if you go to the Sahel, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, in the early days of the military junta, there was a lot of joy and happiness amongst the populace when the military took power. And they were all congratulating the Russians because they believed that the Russians helped install some of these military governments. But in a country like Burkina Faso, it's been over 2 years since after the coup that truncated democracy. And people are now seeing that okay, this did not in any way change the fortunes of the country. Much of Burkina Faso is still being held by, you know, by terrorist groups that are linked to Al Qaeda or the so-called Islamic States. So the satisfaction that the people once had is beginning to dwindle. Yes, but elsewhere in Africa, in Nigeria, for example, people are reading on social media, seeing videos and what have you that are clear disinformation, videos in which they're made to believe that Russia is doing very well in the Sahel and that the military junta, especially in Burkina Faso, is one of the best things that has ever happened to Africa. But in reality, it's not true.
So it's interesting because in the Central African Republic, they seem to have, yeah, and you've already mentioned this, I think, but they seem to have taken advantage of. They're very opportunistic. I think the whole involvement in the Central African Republic might have been pretty opportunistic. Like I think
Yeah.
they got more than they were hoping for, as basically France and Europe just kind of disappeared, and they filled this void. And then suddenly they've got way more power there, and then that gives them a springboard into elsewhere. But also, there's this idea that the Islamic communities of the Central African Republic have received a lot of attention from Wagner. So they're quite anti-Islamic, and I wonder whether that can play well in Nigeria, that has its own issues. I mean, Nigeria is a more functioning democracy, but it's the there's going to be issues with oil money and all sorts. Every country has its challenges, right? But within Nigeria, and I'm no expert, of course you are. You've got your issues with Islamic fundamentalism, and I wonder whether Russia can show themselves to be a solution to that in some way.
Well, Russia is very strategic in what it does in Africa. The reason why it's targeting much of the Islamic community in the Central African Republic is the fact that it has stereotyped Islam. Now, it's a group called the Union for Peace, which is more or less a rebel group that is seeking to gain attention in the Northwest. Now, they feel they have been marginalized and that, a lot of people have targeted their cattle. Of course, this group is from the Fulani ethnic group, which historically cattle rearers. So they feel that they don't have a lot of protection from the government, so they took up arms against the government. Now, much of Russia's war, especially in the Northwest, much of Wagner's war, or let's say in the Northwest, has been against this rebel group, the Union for Peace, and that is why they believe that what the Union for Peace is doing is more or less based on an ideology, an Islamist fundamentalist ideology, than even maybe an agitation for protection and what have you. So that's why it's easy to target them because they're a minority group. They're not using the same tactics in countries like Burkina Faso and Mali because these countries are predominantly Muslim, so you can't target the population because
Yeah,
of
interesting, of course.
yeah.
Yeah.
So in Nigeria, it's also been strategic. Now, when there was a protest against bad governance in Nigeria, much of the people who held Russian flags and banners inviting Russia they were Muslims, because the protest took place mostly in northern Nigeria. The demonstrations with Russian flags took place mostly in northern Nigeria, which is a predominantly Muslim region. So what it does in Africa is guided by a strategy where they feel they could use that to achieve their goals. And mind you, the disinformation that Russia is embarking on, the campaign is embarking on in Africa, is targeted at chasing the West away and also targeted at democracies. Invariably, what Russia wants is administrations that are allied to Russia, that will do Russia's bidding. And also, eventually, there's also having Europe in mind because when you create, conflict and chaos in certain places, it means that you're trying to create opportunity for people to be agitated and to find a new home. Because much of Russia's disinformation is also focused on asking people in the Sahel region and also in West Africa to embrace migration to Europe. Yeah,
Yeah, this is it's all so connected, isn't it? I mean, it's also can be said that this is about undermining Europe and France in
that's
terms of
correct.
European unity. So, the French and European influence is out of Africa and Russia. It's a zero-sum game. So their loss is our gain, very much so. And indeed, as you say, they are. I mean, we talk about how they are trying to influence immigration through Poland, from Belarus, through Finland, and just in general, that these migration smuggling gangs, might have Russian influence, because there's nothing, I think, more powerful in Europe, particularly, to undermine European unity than issues of immigration, and that then you can get your populist governments in, and
Yeah.
we know that Russia have done a really good job of supporting the far left and the far right, particularly the far right, I think, but they don't mind who it is. Like, the far right is better at the moment to support in Europe, because actually they're stronger, and that is because of immigration issues, and so they support the far right. So, like you were saying, they will support Islam and Christianity, or Islamic, groups and Christian groups. It doesn't really matter, as long as it gets them what they want. And I think there's a maxim, which is, some countries control armies, some armies control countries. And what
Yeah.
they would like is to be able to control these countries. And then they don't want democracies to take place, because they will find it much more difficult to exist in a democratic context. Does
Mm.
that all sound about right?
Yes, you're correct. And you look at the countries where they have had proper partnerships. These countries, other than the Central African Republic, these other countries are all under military dictatorship. And in the case of the Central African Republic, that's a country in war. And the president, Tudera, didn't have a choice but to run to Russia if he needed to keep power.
Mm.
So, like you have pointed out, Jonathan, for Russia, it is easier dealing with countries that are first not elected, dealing with governments that first are not elected by the people, and governments that will have no choice but to choose Russia. So that is it. Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, those military junta in those countries, they don't have any choice but to be allied with Russia. The Central African Republic has no choice but to stick to Russia. So now, the disinformation that is spreading across West Africa is aimed at creating chaos, conflict in these countries, and if possible, lead to the breakdown of democracy. Because if that happens, that is the easiest way where Russia can pick a partner. You know, in Nigeria today, for example, you have a stable democracy in the sense that we've been a country, we've been a consistent democratic country since 1999, and we have a government that really has strong relations with the West. But then this is still a country where there's a lot of divisions along ethnic and religious lines, and sometimes people get very intense. And Nigeria has a population of over 220 million people,
Mm.
and that presents a veritable platform for Russia to bring its campaigns of disinformation and calumny. So it is taking advantage of the divisions that exist in my country, to see how it can create chaos that will help in creating more migration issues for Europe, and even if possible, lead to a change in government. Yeah.
Yeah. So it seems like, I mean, Vigo here says, are the Russians using spillover effects to expand across the Sahel from country to country? It does seem like that's happening. And then if you then get a foothold in Nigeria, then that is your massive population. I mean, that's a huge country, Nigeria, really, and having undue influence there is a real concern. I would say more so than most other countries. So somebody else saying that, before we talk more explicitly about the sorts of disinformation that the Russians are involved in. He was late to the party, but I noticed that many of the Vatniks I constantly fight and disprove are black people from Ghana and Nigeria, and to some extent Kenya. Prigozhin opened a branch of the Internet Research Agency in Ghana in 2019. So there's this idea, and that there is evidence to suggest that actually there are internet sort of troll farms that are operational from within Africa. It's, I guess, from Prigozhin's point of view, it might have been the ability to get cheaper labor in order to do that. Is this a thing?
That's correct. I mean, in 2019, there were troll farms opened in Ghana and Nigeria, and the aim was to influence opinions ahead of the U.S. elections in 2020, U.S. presidential election in 2020. And since after that, we've continued to see many Africans, being used by Russia to spread disinformation on social media and also on online and newspapers. I mean, I did a documentary for Al Jazeera that was published a couple of months ago. And while we were working on that documentary, myself and my colleagues went to Togo, Burkina Faso, and some other countries, in West Africa. And then we realized that Russia was actually paying a number of media outlets in the region to spread complete disinformation aimed at targeting France, the US, and even issues in these countries that could easily create chaos. So they do it in many ways. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, it's really scary to me because actually I think they are so good at this, right? And they also don't have to spend an awful lot of money. So the return on investment they get is quite extraordinary. And I've long said, if they'd spent all the money they spent on the war in Ukraine on troll farms and disinformation, if they hadn't invaded Ukraine and spent literally billions and billions of dollars on disinformation campaigns, they would have had far more effect on the world than having invaded Ukraine. Especially Africa, when each of these nations has a vote in the UN, that's really significant, and they can quite easily sway populations in Africa because Europe isn't so interested, and America is pulling out as well. So America's pulled out of bases and places in Africa, and they are not spending money on countering disinformation. The Trump administration is not so concerned with this, and Russia can just step into the black hole. And then we've got China as well.
That's correct. And the Russians have spent as little as $80 just to be able to publish articles in major news papers in Africa, especially in Togo and Burkina Faso. So you can imagine how much $80 can do.
Wow.
As small as $80, but there's a lot of people reading what's clear disinformation. So it's the amount of money that RT, that's the Russian state-owned television, did spend to carry out an influence operation in Canada. I think it was about $10 million or so. If you spend that amount of money in Africa, you'll achieve a lot. You're going to achieve so much. And like you said, Jonathan, you need to spend too much money on this continent to do too much. And that is the concern I have. The fact that this is happening and measures to counter this or to address this are very little, And if you understand how the Russians operate, they don't look too much about long-term planning. They have an idea and then they just go all out to achieve it. So, and that's it. So now, in addition to paying the media in Africa to spread disinformation, they are also training local journalists, some of whom have never left their countries. But now today, the Russians are flying journalists to Moscow on training, taking them to Russian-occupied Ukraine on excursion. These are the kind of incentives that many journalists in this part of the world dream of having to be flown.
Wow, yeah. And it's so cheap and easy. I mean, this is just, like, it's not like Russia can spend minimal amounts of money to get like influence right across a continent, yeah. Whereas like Europe and the US, because we want to do things nicely and do things by the rule of law to a greater extent. Okay, we're not perfect, but there's like we are always on the defensive with disinformation and information, just narratives. Like, I'm not saying that we should go out and disinform people, but we should be going out say the EU or the UK or the US, and spread positive narratives about democracy and the ideals of freedoms
Yeah.
to counter this. But we're not doing that well enough. So, can you give us some more examples of disinformation, the sorts of Russian disinformation that they peddle?
Okay. Well, they have been spreading. They have been publishing articles that claim that the U.S. is sending weapons to amusement parks in Africa. And like in the Central African Republic, they claim that one of the popular parks in Bangui was storing huge ammunition that was sent there by the US. And Russia created a website called the Africa Initiative. Now, this website publishes articles in English, in Arabic, in French, I think in Spanish, and also in Russian. And they also inherited a lot of channels that were created by the Wagner group on Telegram. And if you put together the number of subscribers on Telegram and even YouTube, we're talking about something in excess of 60,000. So on this website, there's a lot of disinformation. They claim that the US is moving bioweapons labs from Ukraine to Africa. And they also setting up new bioweapons labs in Africa. And they also claim about that France, they've made a lot of claims about France and how France is meant to destroy, the Sahel region of Africa. So we see all these sorts of things. And if you look at a lot of local news sites in West Africa and also in Central Africa, you find a lot of stories that claim that America is out to hurt Africa and that Russia is the answer, the solution to the problems in Africa. And there are also social media accounts on TikTok, Telegram, where people speak local languages, local dialects. Like there's one video where some people speaking in the Hausa language, which is a language spoken by tens of millions of people in Nigeria. And in that video, he was calling on people to migrate, to go to Europe, where there are better opportunities to leave Nigeria and find opportunities in Europe. So we see a lot of such kinds of videos and posts. And even when you listen to local radio stations in the Sahel, you hear people talking about migration. For example, if you listen to a program, you will hear commentators talking about how easy it is to travel to Libya through the Sahara Desert as we speak. And that is
Wow.
true. And that is true. If I can take you back to history, in 2015, the then Nigerian government, got the parliament to pass a law that criminalized people smuggling. And the vast majority of sub-Saharan Africans that seek to enter Europe through the Sahara Desert and the Mediterranean Sea actually converge in Niger, in a town called Agadez, in the central part of Niger. And when they get to Agadez, they stay in some chalets and they find a way to rent homes. And the first thing you do once you get to Agadez is to make sure that you can connect with a smuggler, a people smuggler. So in Agadez, every Tuesday, a convoy of vehicles, dozens of vehicles, leave Agadez for Libya every Tuesday. So if you are lucky, you could be in a vehicle that's transporting you to Libya on that Tuesday. If there's too many people who have booked, then you have to wait for any week, any Tuesday that there's availability. So this is the kind of business that happens in Agadez. So you see people moving in convoys, vehicles moving in convoys, carrying migrants across the desert to Libya, from where you have to find another smuggler that will put you in a boat that's crossing the Mediterranean Sea. So the Nigerian government in 2015, having gotten support from the EU, actually got the parliament to pass a law criminalizing people smuggling. So that business in Agadez was suspended because the government began to clamp down on people smugglers. But guess what happened 2 years ago after the military took over in Niger? The military junta quickly suspended that law, effectively decriminalizing people smuggling. So as we speak, we are now seeing thousands of migrants now converge in Agadez, getting on vehicles that's taking them across the desert to Libya. By the way, it's important to note that the military government in Niger is allied to Russia. So you have Russian military instructors in Niger, yeah, and whatever
It's
they do, they get advice from Russia. So you see that Russia is working closely with this government to increase migration, as far as that affects Europe. So that's
It's
what we're seeing.
so bloody clever because it's migration is the thing that is going to undo European unity more than anything. So if whether whatever your views on migration are in general, right? It is a
Yeah.
fact that Reform UK in the UK are gaining popularity because of migration issues. AFD in Germany, Vox in Spain, um, already in Italy, you've got a
Yeah.
ruling right-wing coalition. You've got Rassemblement National in France. You've got all of these right-wing populist parties that are gaining, FPO in Austria, they're gaining more and more popularity because of issues of immigration. And Russia is behind it. Now, we think that we're behind it. They're behind it by just sitting in like internet research agencies in St. Petersburg and spreading disinformation and causing arguments online. But they're actually in the Sahel region of Africa, telling people on radio effectively to go and emigrate to Europe, how easy it is. Here's the way to do it.
Yeah.
We'll help you do that. That is so insidious and far bigger problem than I was previously imagining.
That's correct. And again, they have made it easy for migration to happen from sub-Saharan Africa, at least to North Africa, because Europe faced a huge migrant surge from the West African route up till 2015, 2016. I mean, there was a point where, Europe had its biggest migrant crisis in decades. And that's one reason why the European Union, led by Germany, had to fund Niger to be able to stem the migrant flow. Now, I have actually criticized some of the measures taken by Europe in terms of stemming this migrant flow. Because if you fund the Libyan Coast Guard, what the Libyan Coast Guard will do and what it has been doing is that it's been arresting people and throwing them into jail. Very difficult jails, because in this jail you see all sorts of abuses, all sorts of torture. So I have never said that Europe should fund governments to build more prisons.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yes, so what I've always said is that Europe can help in terms of fighting disinformation, but it's
But
becoming
they're
very
helping. You
difficult.
have to go back to the Sahel to do this. I've often said,
Yeah,
sorry to interrupt you, but I've often said that people like I hear these horrific things that literally I know people that have said this to me, which is, why don't we just shoot the boat people in the English Channel, like blow up? It's like, really, that's where we've got to. Like, the problem is, it's a really complex problem, and there's no
yeah,
point. Yes, we can do deals in the UK, we can do deals with France, and we can try and stop it, but unless you go to the countries where people are
yeah.
saying it is better for me and my family to move to this place for social mobility, to make a better life for myself, than to live here, that's what you've got to stop. So it's about like making places, African countries, like more secure, more stable, to have better welfare systems, to have better opportunities for their people, so that the world is a safer, more stable place, and people don't want to move around in massive ways that are unsustainable for certain countries, so on and so forth. So, but that's a huge problem to try and solve.
You're correct, and that's one issue, one way that this can be addressed. But again, that's a long-term process,
Yeah.
and no guarantees that the amount of money that will be spent on that will not be misused and embezzled
Yeah.
by corrupt governments. But I think that the easy thing to do right now is to at least make sure that not many people are moved by what they hear or what they read or what they watch, from the influence that has come from Russia. Because the numbers of Africans who were seeking to get into Europe through the West African migration route across the Sahara and the Mediterranean Sea had reduced until the Russian disinformation begun
Right.
in recent
Yeah.
years. And also until Niger fell into the hands of the military. So I tell you, Jonathan, what we see in Africa every single day, especially on social media, is too much to handle. The amount of disinformation sponsored by Russia that continues to appear on our feeds on X, whether it's on Facebook, on Telegram, TikTok, everywhere. It's alarming. It's so alarming. And when I started to speak about this, I thought I didn't get enough people listening. And till date, I still don't think there are many people listening. Last year, the Africa Center for Strategic Studies carried out a workshop on disinformation in Ghana and Nigeria. I was in Washington, D.C., where I went to appear before Congress to speak on the issues to speak on Russia's imperial identity. But I had to come back early to Nigeria to be able to attend that program, just to understand what is being done to address these issues. And while that program was so important because it focused on fact checkers, people who fact check what's wrong. So that was the training that the Africa Center for Strategic Studies carried out for media personalities. But then I realized that there's a huge gap because a fact checker can actually fact check and come up with the truth. But that truth may never be published because most times the people who the Russians contact directly are the editors. In fact, much of the stories that you read on newspapers are stories in which the Russians or Russian agents have directly contacted either the online editor or the news editor without even so they did not in any way get through reporters or correspondents or fact checkers. It's editors directly. So that same editor can receive a draft, a file from his correspondent or his fact checker telling him or her that a particular allegation made by a particular account or a particular story on social media is fake. And the editor may decide not to even publish that fact check because he is already working indirectly for Russia by virtue of the fact that he or she has been paid by a Russian agent to publish Russia's disinformation. So I felt it was important that trainings should target editors and even publishers. There are some editors who are not aware of Russia's influence campaign. Yes, some are aware and they're doing so because of money. And there are also many publishers who are not even aware of what's going on. So if we target these people, then that helps in the sense that, even there could even be penalties for publishing this information.
Yeah, it's a shame that social media companies seem to have gone away from attempting to moderate and attempting to regulate at all, and it's like free speech absolutism, which is basically an excuse to allow Russia to do what they like. But certainly, if you're thinking, well, Russia can pay $80 to get an article written in a major newspaper, then surely, I mean, it's a money game, isn't it? Surely it's just about paying that newspaper even more to have an editor that doesn't allow that to happen. So it's just a battle of who can control these outlets and whatnot. But yeah, is social media an issue in Africa, or is it like more old school media like radio, TV, and print media?
Well, it's not an issue in the sense that, or how do I put it? First of all, in terms of usage, internet penetration in Africa has grown massively in the last couple of years. So there are so many people who have access to the internet and many people using social media, particularly Facebook. And there are also many people who use the cable networks, and the terrestrial TV has coverage that goes all across many towns, villages, and cities, especially here in West Africa. Now, Russia has recognized what functions these platforms play. And while you have, what social media does is that it creates opportunities for insults, creates opportunities for anyone to air an opinion. So sometimes you see a post that has been shared by a very huge influencer from Nigeria who's got massive following, millions of followers, hundreds of thousands of followers. And there are some of these influencers whose followers who have cult following. Whatever they post, whether it's true or not, the people who any day, anytime will stand by them, who will defend them, and what have you. So that's why it is spreading. Russian disinformation is spreading faster on social media because one person posts, he's got massive number of followers who are commenting and who are helping to spread, what he or she has posted. and then they now create an environment that is so toxic. For example, there's a particular influencer who posted um, about me, saying that I was an agent of the West who was helping to make Russia look bad. And the next thing, I saw a lot of mentions on my ex account, people insulting me, people saying all sorts of bad words about me, discrediting me, and what have you. So that's what you get now on social media, because the usage, people who use social media are growing, and you know what is being shared on social media has a way of even getting into homes, because people are talking about it on the streets. People are talking about Russia's good. People are talking about what's been done that is so good in Burkina Faso, and it's spreading everywhere in homes. So, but anyhow, you look at it, whether it's social media, whether it's mainstream media, whether it's the newspapers, electronic media, Russia has targeted every sphere of communication, and they're gaining grounds. Yeah.
Yeah, it as I've posted a couple of times here, fake news travels 6 times faster than truth on Twitter. So we already know that truth is at a disadvantage. And I know when someone said that our narrative is truth, well, yeah,
Yeah.
that's fair enough to say we could, but I don't think we can just rely on something being true. That's not to say we should lie, but
Yeah.
what we need to think about is how to amplify the truth in a more effective way.
Mm.
So what are the sorts of things then that you advocate should be done? Like how do we go about solving this problem of Russian disinformation? And is there disinformation in Africa from China as well? What's the Chinese influence looking like at the moment?
Well, China's disinformation is not as big as Russia, and we haven't even seen so much about Chinese disinformation. I have to be
Yeah,
honest. The vast majority of posts that target the West or target democracies have come from Russia. Yeah, and the Chinese kind of disinformation is only based on issues around influence, in the sense that they're talking about how China can be beneficial to
yeah.
Africa, and what China has done, what Africa was before China, and what have you. They just doing things that, and is aimed at making China look like as if Africa has found gold, or Africa will find gold if Africa lets China, get involved in every sector of Africa's industrialization. So
Well,
that's
just on that point, actually, because I think that's a really interesting point you make there. Vigo says, do Russians promote themselves or do they only denigrate others? So you were talking about China's promoting how they have helped change, but it's not been so anti, whereas Russia is very much slag off the other people, say how terrible the US or France
yes,
is, and then fill in the void. So Russia and previously the USSR has always been cultural exchange and socio-economic development as vehicles for submersion, is what Vigo said. And then someone else says as well, yeah, here it is. So it's Vigo again. Russia promotes division, polarization, and subjugation. Democracy is about jointly moving forward by finding compromises through respect for one another. So there's a very negative approach to how Russia does things, which is, they are gaining. They see everything in a real zero-sum game. So if someone else loses, they just naturally gain. They don't have to shout about how amazing they are to push themselves up. What they do is it's all relative. So if everyone else is terrible, they look better in comparison. That's how I would understand it.
yes, that's correct. And Russia acts very desperate, and in fact, they're desperate, and they want to do anything and everything to make sure that they get influence so quick, so fast. They don't have patience to even achieve things. So that's why they do what they do, and that's why they act the way they act, because they want results quickly. It seems as if the fact that the invasion of Ukraine, which has led to multiple sanctions from left, right, center, is making them desperate for new friends and desperate for influence elsewhere.
Yeah.
But that's exactly how they operate, you know, denigrating others, propping themselves up. And each time the Russians say France is bad, the US is bad, the West is bad, they give the other option of themselves, that we're the better people for Africa.
So
And you ask,
how do we solve it then? Yeah.
yes, that's what I was going to go into.
Yeah.
Now, many people in Africa are also influential. There's so many influencers on social media, so many influencers in mainstream media. But some of them have decided to just watch because they don't think that this concerns them so much. And many of those who are active in terms of the Russia's disinformation campaign, they don't do so. They're not active because they love Russia so much. Some of them are active because Russia has been able to reach out to them and in some cases pay them to achieve this. So I think the West can help by first creating more programs, more workshops where African journalists, editors, publishers, and what have you can get to understand what is involved. Now, I tell you, Jonathan, I've been working a lot. I've been working a lot in the media in the last 5 years, trying to uncover Russian atrocities and then also uncover some of Russia's campaign of disinformation. But I didn't even know much about Russia's imperial identity until I went to the US last year to testify at Congress. When I met people like Timothy Schneider, Botak Kasimbekova. So I got to learn more about Russia's history in things like this. So we need to also create platforms where many people here in Africa can understand exactly the background of this of Russia's operations. So the media, there are many people in the media who are willing to attend workshops like this. There are many people in the media who are willing to get involved. But it doesn't end there. Russia is using influencers on social media to spread this information. We could also, there should be a way to target some influencers too on social media. Who, I'm not saying that people have to go and say Russia and insult Russia. I'm saying that we have a responsibility to say what is true, to counter the narratives that are going on in the media, and then just tell people what is true. So we can begin from there.
What's really frustrating is that USAID funding was completely cut, right? Essentially,
Yeah.
Pretty much functionally cut almost all of the funding. And although this was seen as controversial because people didn't understand it, there was USAID funding that went to the BBC, and people were like, that's terrible. What are American taxpayers doing funding the BBC? But they didn't understand that it was going to a BBC charity called what's it called? BBC Media Action. So BBC Media Action does, I think, what you're talking about, which is train up journalists in places around the world that need democracy, that need free press to be operating, for journalists to be responsible and do the right thing. And the BBC is actually involved in doing that kind of training, maybe the sorts that you're talking about to some degree. Then the USAID funding being cut is that soft power being cut. And you can see they're funding the BBC charity that then funds journalists to do this kind of work. You then stop that funding, and then you're losing journalists being able to fight against this kind of disinformation that you're seeing come from Russia. It's just another way of giving up power to Russia. It's really frustrating. But yeah, I totally get you. I mean, there just needs to be lots of more focus and then funding going to places like, the Sahel region.
And it has to be aggressive too, in the sense that if you can focus as many journalists as possible, and if every newsroom in Africa with much funding, if every newsroom in Africa can get at least one person who gets to attend, programs like this, where they understand what's going on, they understand, the world we live in right now, the thinking of Russia, the background of these kinds of operations and what have you, that will help in many ways. Because what is driving instability right now in Africa, as number one on the list, is disinformation. What is also helping to drive migration to Europe from the West African route is disinformation. What is giving Russia a stronger footing in Africa is disinformation. And what has helped strengthen military juntas in Africa is disinformation. And it's growing like wildfire. And I'm not trying to sound, make people panic, but I'm just stating the obvious. The
I'm with
reality
you.
of
I'm with you, mate. I'm with you.
yeah. So when I first started to talk about migration from Africa, some people thought I was crazy, but now a lot of people are seeing what I'm talking about, because you see a lot of, fake news and disinformation on radio, on TV, social media. It's growing every single day.
A question from Julian here, and thank you very much, Julian, for supporting the channel. He says, "Are there signs of Ukrainian forces operating to counter Russia?" So we've heard that Ukrainian armed forces have been active, or special forces have been active in Sudan to try and work against the Russian interests in Sudan, because if Russia's getting money from Africa to fund their war against Ukraine, then Ukraine has an interest in stopping that money flowing, stopping that influence from having an effect in Africa. We hear about Tuareg rebels as well being supported by Ukraine against what was Wagner, probably now the Africa Corps. Is there any light that you can cast on this?
Well, I know that Ukraine has helped share information, with groups or with entities that is helping fight against Russian influence, whether it's in Sudan or in Mali. And I know that Ukraine wants to get more and more involved in Africa because much of Russian disinformation in Africa has also targeted Ukraine. They're trying to make Africans realize the belief that the war that Russia is fighting in Ukraine was created by Ukraine. I mean, the understanding here in Africa regarding Russia's war in Ukraine is very different from the reality, because many people are made to believe that Ukraine was so close to joining NATO until Putin said no. Putin warned Ukraine that you don't have to join NATO, otherwise I would invade. But Ukraine was stubborn and decided that they were going to join NATO, and then all of a sudden Russia invaded. Some people also made to believe that Ukraine was willing to take nuclear weapons from the West to be able to harm Russia. So these are the kinds of disinformation that the Russians have been spreading in Africa to make Ukraine look very bad. So Ukraine also has a duty, at least, to be able to stop some of what Russia is doing. Maybe difficult doing so in terms of having to send boots on the ground, because they're facing a war back in Ukraine where they need a lot of help as possible. But I think Ukraine can also help in the sense that they can find ways to counter some of what is being spoken out there. I want Ukraine to have stronger relations with Africa, trust me, because there's a lot that Ukraine can achieve. And Ukraine must be seen as a country that's a victim in this war and not an enabler, as Russia wants people to believe. So,
yeah, interesting.
The involvement in Africa is not much, but that can change.
So Sophie Dox here says, Africa has no reason to trust either the EU, the US, or Russia. Europe with its colonialist past, Russia with its imperial present, and the US going into an utterly stupid future. But also that kind of leads into this opinion from Michael Vuchar, who says, my only question, JP, for your guest, can you get him to speak on the refusal of the global South to recognize Russia as a colonial power, because they are traditionally a land-based power versus a water-based? I don't know whether that is playing a part, but so the point Michael's making is traditionally in history, colonial powers like Britain would be going around the world via navies and putting their flags in different countries and saying, right, we own you now, whereas Russia has spread out from its own geographical land into neighboring areas, but hasn't really gone to other areas of the world using a navy, and so they're not seen as a colonial power. But now they've kind of infiltrated. They don't need to, they just need to fly enough people over there and then control these kind of disinformation outlets, and you can get power in Africa. So I guess the counter narrative is to show that Russia are as much a colonial power as France was, and that as a colonial power they're being oppressive and using brutality to get their way. Is that an approach that needs to be taken to try and show people in Africa that these guys are just more white colonists?
Jonathan, we're no longer in the colonial era. That time has passed. When the era of technological advancement, people are thinking about how to make the economies stronger. Now, Africa no longer has primitive people. At the time when the Western nations came to Africa to colonize us, I mean, we were so blindfolded about where the world was at the time, and a lot of people were very primitive. But that era has passed. You can no longer seek to influence people using force and deceit in today's world in the 21st century. So the best way.
Aren't you saying that they can, though? I mean, Russia are using both force and deceit to have power.
But you look at the results. We're having hundreds of people, if not thousands, being killed. We're having instability. The world is, so unstable. We have passed the Cold War era, So they must think of it. I mean, this is the era of technology. There's a lot of communication channels, social media channels. And whatever you do now can never be as easy as what, our forebears or what the colonial masters did at the time. So they're not going to get it easy because there will be a lot of, at some point, the people in Central African Republic will fight back. At some point, people in Mali will fight back. But that will only create more chaos, more conflict, more instability. Because you have two sets of people not agreeing. Some people are for Russia and some are against Russia. So when one day a government that is anti-Russia takes power in the Central African Republic, you will see conflict grow again. So what I keep saying that the Russians don't think well enough about what happens in the long term. It's about now. What can be achieved now? We're fighting Ukraine now. How can we get more friends now? How can we get money now to get involved in Ukraine? How can we get fighters from Africa now to fight in Ukraine? So it's all about what I can achieve now. Yeah. And this strategy, I don't think will work in the long term. That's what. And look, I hate it when people can think that in Africa today you can still achieve neocolonialism. Which, I mean, what Russia is doing is more or less neocolonialism. And whether or not it's going to work eventually is a huge question. But Russia, excuse me, Russia has never really been involved in terms of colonialism beyond areas around Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
They were never really involved in Africa. They were never involved in the Caribbean. They were never really involved in Asia. So if you couldn't achieve this hundreds of years ago, why do you think that can happen now? So recognizing Russia as a colonial power, really, maybe people can talk about it in Europe, in Eastern Europe, but nowhere can one talk about Russia being a colonial power out of that bloc.
It's funny because the more I do my geopolitical channel, the more I realize it's about democracy. Democracy is the key to stability and economic stability, which is the key to, and the rule of law. You're more likely to get the rule of law established fairly in a democracy than you are in a totalitarian dictatorship or whatnot. And what Nigeria has a functioning democracy. What the Sahel needs is a more functioning democracy. And the problem is then how do you go and establish that without it looking like a regime change from other kind of countries outside trying to mess around with the countries in Sahel? But these are long-term projects that need to establish democracy more firmly in these nations. It's difficult.
Yes, that's correct. And like you have pointed out, this is an attack on democracy. And I don't think that Russia's aim, in fact, in Africa, eventually is more or less about Europe, if you look at it critically. Now, whatever Russia is doing is to gain control, gain money, be able to use the resources that they have gotten from Africa for its war in Europe. I mean, they don't have much options right now with all the sanctions that they're getting from the US and from Europe. So now they're looking at Africa where they can at least get off resources and then help fund that war. But also they're looking at Africa as a gateway to Europe in terms of migration. So everything they do, you look at it from the underneath, it is about how do we get what we need to fight Ukraine? How do we get what we need to defeat NATO? How do we get what we need to destabilize Europe? So this is more or less a vehicle.
I totally agree, actually, because I think Europe is the bogeyman of Russia. It's not the US. The US is not geographically close to Russia. And the EU are the one institution that can stand up to Russia and do stand up to Russia more, I think, significantly than the US, although the US is obviously super important as well. But actually, Putin wants to undermine the European Union because that is the locus of power in his immediate world. And I think once you understand his desire to undo the EU, everything else seems to fit into place. So I would agree with that. I've got a question, slightly different question, as we sort of meander towards the end, Philip. This is from Paul Gilbert. It says, I've been reading that of the increasingly successful greening of the Sahel. So this is a Sahel region where there have been greening campaigns to make it green and therefore, more sustainable for economies and the environment, et cetera, et cetera. Are these programs now at risk? Do Russia, are there all sorts of other programs that might have been beneficial to the region at risk with Russian influence?
Well, I mean, the whole issue of greening, as you put it, Paul, has always been at risk in the Sahel because this is a region where there's a lot of instability. As I speak to you right now, more than half of Burkina Faso is being controlled by terrorist groups. And if they wanted to, this is my opinion, if the terrorists wanted to override the capital, Ouagadougou, they would have. But I believe that the reason why they're not doing so is because it may be easy to target them if they take control of power. So I'm saying this because I want you to understand that the whole of that region is really anything good in that region is under threat as we speak. And when there is chaos and conflict, it means that programs cannot be first implemented, and programs cannot be monitored, programs cannot be maintained. So Russia's involvement in the Sahel, if it continues to create conflict in the sense that if it makes more armed groups agitated and willing to fight the Russians, then it means that whatever action or whatever plans that these countries have in terms of making their areas more green becomes affected. So basically, when you have a power that is willing to create divisions, willing to let people move away from their areas to find greener pastures elsewhere, it means that part of the people who you're encouraging to migrate may come from sectors that are even helping to fight against climate change and issues around greenhouse gases. So yes, you always expect that there'll be issues with Russia's campaign in Africa and how this affects, climate change.
Yeah, it's amazing how everything in the world is connected. Like the more I do these my geopolitical videos and whatnot, it's just everything is a spider web of
Yeah.
connection in one way or another. Well, look, Philip, I mean, this has been an absolutely fascinating talk, and it is so important. I think disinformation is the single biggest challenge. Okay, climate change and there are wars in places, but wars in places are underwritten by information. The first
Yeah.
casualty of war is truth,
Mm.
and disinformation. And indeed, with climate change, the amount of disinformation flying around about climate change. So, like for me, disinformation is humanity's single biggest overarching challenge in the decades to come, and there's no, I think, more obvious battlefield for disinformation than in the Sahel region, and you are fighting on the front lines there. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you would like to express?
Well, I will only continue to reiterate that we are facing a huge issue with Russia's disinformation campaign, which is growing. And in North Africa, you have RT in Algeria that's helping to spread disinformation. RT now is being able to can be accessed by many countries in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, and they are one angle where Africa gets one platform where Africa gets lots of information from. Sadly, this information is always distorted, and the truth is usually hidden. So my concern is the fact that this information is growing, and my worry is the fact that we haven't done a lot to counter and to combat it. So
Mm,
the more we treat this issue with kid gloves, the more Russia has its way.
mm. The more we talk about it, people need to know about it more, and that's kind of
Yeah.
why we're doing this, I guess. Well, look, Philip, if you ever want to come on and talk about, I mean, there's so much more to talk about, I'm sure. You are always welcome. Just reach out to me if you want to platform anything that you have written, anything, any work that you are concerning yourself with. Honestly, I will platform what you do in the blink of an eye, because I think it's so important. And thank you for doing the work that you do in places that we barely think about. Many of us sitting, not in Africa. And it's not amazingly safe either, considering that you are writing against the interests of the Russian Federation. So thank you so much. I just before I give you kind of the last words and whatnot, just a few thanks. Graham Baker, thank you very much for supporting the channel, really appreciate that. Arne Anderson, Tea Time, thank you for your new Norwegian support there. Art, who says that he's really happy to actually join a live because this one's so early because he's in New Zealand. Thank you, JP and Philip, for this fascinating interview. I've learnt so much. That's awesome, Art. Thank you. Look, mate, I appreciate your time. Any kind of last words or anything you want to say?
Well, it's very important that people know that what we do as journalists here in Africa is to focus on the truth. And the truth is that we're facing difficult times right now. And we have an issue where we must all come together to battle. Now, Africa loses risking its democracy, and Africa's democracy is shaky right now. And if we continue to allow disinformation thrive, then we will have more democracies fall. In about a year, under a year, about 4 democracies in West Africa fell to military governments, and no one is really safe. So I think that we have a lot of work to do. We must come together to achieve it.
Yeah. Absolutely, 100%. Well, look, mate, stay on the line. But in the meantime, thank you so much, Philip. And I can't wait to speak to you again. I'm sure we will cross paths in terms of there's lots more to talk about, and Russia aren't going anywhere soon, I don't think, in the Sahel region as much as I'd like them to. In terms of the audience, thank you for tuning in. I know we'll not have any of the American audience, mainly apart from those who are up in the middle of the night with no better thing to do than to listen to myself and Philip, which is, a veritable gold mine of information. So thank you to Philip for that. But so thank you, Philip. Thank you, audience. Thank you, mods. We had typically a couple of Russian bots on the live stream, and that's what you're going to get, because this is what we're talking about. Philip, thank you. Thanks everyone else. Toodle pips, and I'll be speaking to you all later with my normal videos.
Thank you.